attacks against American citizens.
Need to go down there.
They shoot journalists, and he says this is death. Blooded.
Survived the war zone. I thought I was sending it to this. But here...
Misunderstanding here. What?
Oh my God.
Get in the car! Get in the car!
I'm back.
One nation under God with liberty.
Go, 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 go!
God bless America.
Civil War, 2024 Analyses and Explanations. Civil War 2024 is examined here through a series of in-depth analyses and explanations that dissect its narrative architecture, thematic intentions, and cinematic execution. Civil War 2024 operates as a visceral auditory and visual experience that deliberately eschews partisan finger-pointing to focus on the corrosion of the human soul. This exploration of Civil War 2024 begins with the understanding that writer-director Alex Garland engineered the film not as a traditional war epic, but as a tone poem about journalistic ethics at the end of the world. The following analyses and explanations of Civil War 2024 will delve into how the film constructs its horrifyingly familiar, yet politically ambiguous landscape. Within this dissection of Civil War 2024, we must acknowledge the film's refusal to provide a traditional backstory, a choice that serves as the central key to unlocking its meaning. The analyses and explanations regarding Civil War 2024 must consistently return to the idea that the camera lens is both a shield and a weapon, a barrier against feeling and an instrument of truth. This comprehensive look at Civil War 2024 posits that the film's true antagonist is not a political faction, but the numbing effect of perpetual violence on the observer. Alex Garland's film begins with these analyses and explanations, acknowledging that it is a provocative and visceral entry into the dystopian thriller genre, distinct for its sharp focus on the journalists documenting the chaos. The following analyses and explanations unpack how, released by A24 in April 2024, the film became the studio's second highest-grossing film, earning over $127 million worldwide against a $127 million worldwide against a $50 million budget, a financial success matched by intense debate regarding its refusal to explain its own politics. This comprehensive breakdown of analyses and explanations covers the plot, themes, character arcs, and the specific directorial choices that define this modern war film. These analyses and explanations begin with the understanding that writer-director Alex Garland engineered the project not as a traditional war epic, but as a tone poem about journalistic ethics at the end of the world. Within this dissection, we must acknowledge the film's refusal to provide a traditional backstory, a choice that serves as the central key to unlocking its meaning. The world building is established not through scrolling text of historical grievances, but through environmental decay, a technique central to these analyses and explanations. The film drops the audience directly into a fractured United States where an authoritarian federal government, led by a third-term president, serves a fascist agenda, having disbanded the FBI and authorized airstrikes on citizens. The analyses and explanations highlight that the president's administration has taken a totalitarian turn, yet we never learn his party affiliation, focusing instead on the constitutional crisis of a leader refusing to vacate office. The most powerful secessionist threat is the Western forces, an improbable alliance between Texas and California marching on Washington, D.C., a strange alliance signaling that the conflict is not meant to be mapped onto current electoral divides. The film's geography, as these analyses and explanations reveal, is a symbolic battlefield where the why matters far less than the what. The plot follows a team of journalists driving from New York City to D.C. for one final objective: to interview the president before the Western forces storm the Capitol and execute him. The most controversial decision Garland makes is the absolute refusal to explain who is fighting who or why. The analyses and explanations delve into the fact that the why is treated as irrelevant, a deliberate philosophical choice stripping the conflict of specific left versus right ideology to force the viewer to focus solely on the human cost. Critics on Rotten Tomatoes noted that the film is gripping and unsettling, but some found the lack of context frustrating, calling it an intrinsically political film with no politics where the scenario is so barebones it never leaves an impression beyond the surface level. However, these analyses and explanations argue that Garland is not making a documentary about secession, but a film about observation, positing that political justifications dissolve when faced with a mass grave or a sniper's bullet. The film's most chilling moment, crucial to these analyses and explanations, comes when the journalists encounter a uniformed militia led by an unnamed soldier played by Jesse Plemons. He asks the group where they are from, and when the Hong Kong journalists answer, he executes them for not being American, in a scene representing the closest the film gets to a direct political statement. These analyses and explanations interpret this sequence as a horrifying illustration of how civil war devolves into ethnic or nativist bloodletting, completely untethered from the original political debate. The soldier wears no flag, signifying the rise of rogue violence beyond the command of any organized faction. The protagonist ensemble represents a spectrum of journalistic engagement and burnout, a dynamic these analyses and explanations will fully deconstruct. The narrative functions as a dual-character study between the seasoned veteran and the rookie, using them as instruments of recording history. Lee Smith, brought to life by Kirsten Dunst, carries a palpable weight of exhaustion that constitutes the film's emotional core. These analyses and explanations must note that Lee is inspired by real-life World War II correspondent Lee Miller, who famously photographed the horrors of Dachau and now operates on autopilot, having seen every conceivable atrocity. She begins as the ultimate professional, teaching her young companion that the job is to record, not to feel, and famously admits she would photograph her partner's death if it happened. In a tragic irony, her resilience finally cracks when she breaks her own rule. After Sammy dies, she takes a photo of his body but immediately deletes it, the first time she refuses to document. Her final act, highlighted in these analyses and explanations, is not taking a photo but pushing the younger girl out of the line of fire, sacrificing herself because she finally felt a maternal protection in a profession that demands total detachment. Jessie, played with a raw fragility by Kelly Spaney, serves as the audience surrogate, arriving naive and scared, which allows these analyses and explanations to track a harrowing transformation. The film meticulously charts her desensitization. Early on, she is too scared to take photos of torture at a gas station, paralyzed by fear. By the climax, she steps into live fire to get the shot, and the brutal ending shows her falling to the ground after her mentor saves her life. Instead of screaming or crying, she raises her camera and photographs a dead body in the grass, a direct answer to the earlier hypothetical that she will indeed take the photo. These analyses and explanations argue that to survive in this world, The young woman must completely kill her empathy, completing her birth as a hardened cynic. Sammy, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, is the moral compass and the heart of the film, a role these analyses and explanations view as essential for representing old-world journalistic ethics. He is the only one who vocalizes the absurdity of their quest, knowing the president is a monster, yet wanting the interview purely for the historical record. His death saving the group from the militant soldier represents a gut punch precisely because he represented a fading era of principled reporting. The climax occurs inside the White House, and these analyses and explanations focus on the moment of dark satire, where Joel stops the soldiers to ask the president for a quote. The president, stripped of his power, simply pleads, "Don't let them kill me," a pathetic soundbite that satisfies the journalist, who then steps aside. The Western forces execute the president on the spot, in a display of raw, jungle justice that erases jurisprudence and replaces it with spectacle. The film never establishes the secessionist's political platform because they kill him not for a specific ideological reason, but because he is the symbol of the failed state. The soldiers pose for a photograph like hunters with a deer, an image these analyses and explanations suggest defines the film's view of civil war. Rob Hardy's cinematography is a standout element, utilizing a stark, documentary style that lingers on the unthinkable sights of a burning America. The sound design is praised for gunshots that are not cinematic pops, but sharp, frightening cracks that cause audiences to flinch, a technique these analyses and explanations recognize as essential to the film's visceral impact. The film uses silence masterfully, particularly in a scene highlighting the absurdity of war. A sniper battle at a dilapidated Winter Wonderland Christmas fair. As Jingle Bells plays on a broken loop and journalists hide behind bumper cars, a soldier answers a question about who is shooting with the nihilistic exchange. "Someone is trying to kill us. We are trying to kill them." The critical reception, as documented in these analyses and explanations, shows a Rotten Tomatoes score of 81%, describing a gripping and unsettling experience, while some user reviews deem it too hollow to have real impact. Many critics praise it as a magnificent and earth-shattering experience, or a midlife crisis of a nation. The debate about whether it is truly about America continues, as Garland is British and has stated the film is a general anti-war statement rather than a direct U.S. prediction, yet the imagery is aggressively specific. The film critiques political violence, the normalization of murder as a solution, and media complicity where journalists do not stop the killing but profit from the aesthetic of it. The mention of a third-term president serves as a clear dystopian warning against autocratic overreach. The final verdict from these analyses and explanations is that the film is a tone poem about professional detachment. If one expects a traditional action flick or a detailed political thriller, the experience will disappoint, but as a character study of how trauma becomes ordinary, it is devastating. It is less about the fall of a nation and more about the fall of the individual soul when it chooses to look rather than act. A photographer dies, but her camera lives on in the next generation, ensuring that someone will always be there to document the horror, even if no one stops it. The opening image of the film offers a masterclass in subverting audience expectations through the deliberate aestheticization of a presidential address, a figure rehearsing a hollow, propagandistic speech while the world burns silently beyond his fortified perimeter. These analyses and explanations recognize that Alex Garland immediately establishes a dissonance between official narrative and objective reality, a schism that the war correspondents will spend the entire runtime navigating with their lenses. The president practices gestures of control, yet the flicker of genuine fear in his eyes betrays an acute awareness that his authority evaporates the moment the Western forces breach the capital's outer defenses. This performance of power, divorced from actual governance, functions as the film's thesis statement on the fragility of authoritarian regimes that have abandoned constitutional legitimacy. The director refuses to grant the audience the comfort of a televised crawl explaining the secession, instead forcing us to rely on overheard radio chatter, graffiti on crumbling overpasses, and the exhausted chatter of refugees. The immersive disorientation replicates the lived experience of civilians caught in a conflict zone, where information is fragmented, rumor-based, and weaponized by every faction simultaneously. Garland understands that in modern warfare, epistemology itself becomes a battlefield, and the journalist's quest for a final interview represents a desperate grasp at a definitive historical record that may no longer exist. Kirsten Dunst's performance as Lee constitutes one of the great cinematic portraits of post-traumatic stress disorder, achieved not through histrionic breakdowns, but through a terrifying absence where emotional reactivity should reside. Her face, weathered and prematurely aged by 2 decades of documenting humanity's worst impulses, has become a neutral mask that only the camera's intimate close-ups can penetrate. These analyses and explanations note that Lee's Missouri accent and salt-of-the-earth pragmatism ground her as an essentially American archetype, the hardened professional who has seen too much to believe in patriotic bromides. When she mutters that her role is simply to record so others can ask questions, she articulates a philosophy of radical journalistic passivity that the film will systematically interrogate and ultimately condemn. The scene where she photographs a dying militia member without offering comfort crystallizes her ethical framework, one that prioritizes the historical document over the immediate human connection. Her admission that she would capture the death of her own colleague reveals not cruelty, but a profound dissociation, a survival mechanism that has calcified into an identity. The film carefully tracks the micro-fissures in this armor. The slight tremor in her hands when cleaning her lens, the way her breathing changes when entering a combat zone she once would have navigated with instinctual calm. Lee represents an entire generation of war correspondents who have outlived their own emotional deaths, moving through the world as ghosts who happen to still possess heartbeats. Kelly Spaney's Jessie Cullen is introduced as the precise inverse of her eventual mentor, a girl whose empathy overwhelms her instinct for self-preservation, leaving her frozen and useless during the gas station sequence. The analyses and explanations emphasize that her arc follows the grim logic of a fairy tale in reverse, where the naive heroine does not find her way home, but instead becomes permanently lost in the dark forest of trauma. Her physicality transforms throughout the film, beginning with a hunched, defensive posture that gradually straightens into a purposeful, almost predatory alertness. When she first looks through her viewfinder, she flinches at the recoil of a gunshot several blocks away. Yet by the finale she steps calmly into the space where bullets are landing to frame her composition. This transformation is not celebrated as empowerment, but mourned as a spiritual death, the extinguishing of the very quality that made her human in favor of a mechanical excellence. The film's sound design supports this arc, gradually lowering the volume of her involuntary gasps and whimpers until, by the Oval Office sequence, she moves in complete silence. Spaney's performance captures the terrifying moment when fear exhausts itself and leaves behind only a professional's cold curiosity about the image potential of a scene. Her final photograph represents not an act of courage, but an irreversible crossing of a line from which no recovery is possible. The audience is denied catharsis, forced instead to sit with the queasy recognition that the best war photographer is one who has killed the part of themselves that recoils from horror. The intergenerational tension between Lee and Jessie operates as the film's central dramatic engine, complicating any simplistic reading of mentorship as purely benevolent. These analyses and explanations observe that Lee simultaneously wants to protect Jessie from her fate, while also recognizing that the younger woman possesses a raw talent that will inevitably pull her toward the abyss. Their dynamic mirrors the relationship between addiction and recovery, with Lee as the veteran addict who knows the destruction her substance brings yet cannot help but show the newcomer exactly how to find it. The scene where Lee teaches Jessie to use slide film rather than digital serves as both practical lesson and initiation ritual, the passing down of a tactile, almost sacred knowledge about how to make suffering aesthetically legible. When Lee critiques Jessie's early photographs for being too safe, she is essentially goading her toward the very danger that will eventually consume her. The film refuses to resolve this contradiction, instead allowing the toxicity and tenderness of their bond to coexist in uncomfortable proximity. Their shared gender adds another layer, as 2 women navigate a masculine theater of war where their credibility must be constantly proven through proximity to violence. The bathtub scene, where Lee washes the dried blood of a dead colleague from her hair while Jessie watches from the doorway, becomes an unspoken confession that this life will cost absolutely everything. Stephen McKinley Henderson's Sammy functions as the ghost of journalism's past, an elderly, obese man whose physical vulnerability makes his presence in the combat zone seem almost suicidally reckless. These analyses and explanations highlight that Sammy deliberately invokes the mythology of the New York Times as an institution of record, a secular priesthood whose authority once seemed as permanent as the Roman Catholic Church. His nostalgic recollections of covering stories before digital photography and the 24-hour news cycle reveal an entire lost civilization of journalistic practice. The film grants him the most articulate expressions of its thematic preoccupations, including the devastating observation that they are documenting a war that their profession arguably failed to prevent. His mobility issues, which require the group to stop frequently, literalize the impediment that old-school editorial standards represent in an environment that rewards speed and spectacle over verification and context. When Sammy sacrifices himself to save the younger journalists from the Jesse Plemons character, the act carries a double symbolic weight. He dies not only to protect their bodies, but also, perhaps futilely, to preserve the idea that journalism can be something more than a parasitic documentation of suffering. The moment the truck drives away from his corpse in the rearview mirror, the film signals that the old ethical order has been definitively left behind. His final words, a quiet acknowledgement that he knew this was always how his story would end, resonate as a self-fulfilling prophecy from a man who understood that bearing witness is a terminal profession. Jesse Plemons appears in a sequence that has rightly become the film's most discussed set piece, a concentrated dose of domestic terror that makes the abstract horrors of civil war suddenly and unbearably concrete. His character wears a pair of distinctive red sunglasses that obscure his eyes, transforming him from an individual into an archetype of arbitrary violence. The analyses and explanations note that the militiaman's interrogation about where people are from deliberately echoes real-world ethnic cleansing, where ancestry and geography become capital crimes. His massive physical frame, clad in generic military surplus rather than identifiable uniform, suggests the proliferation of violence beyond state control into the hands of ordinary citizens who have decided to become executioners. The pit filled with bodies covered in quicklime, which the journalists glimpse before being dragged away, functions as an image of industrialized atrocity that deliberately invokes Holocaust photography. Plemons delivers his dialogue with a horrifying casualness, as if he is asking about the weather or a sports score while deciding who lives and who dies. The sequence forces the audience to hold their breath, recreating the physiological experience of terror that journalism typically translates into a safely consumable product. When the Hong Kong journalists are shot, the film refuses to grant them heroic last words or lingering death scenes, instead presenting their executions as brutally instantaneous. This narrative choice argues that death in civil war is not cinematic but administrative, a problem of disposal rather than tragedy. Joel, played by Wagner Moura, represents the ideological shapeshifter whose commitment to the story transcends any allegiance to truth or consequence. These analyses and explanations position him as the embodiment of journalism's complicity in spectacle, a man whose professional ambitions and libidinal energies have merged into a single drive toward the big score. His pursuit of the presidential interview functions less as a public service than as a career-capping trophy, the ultimate get that will secure his legacy. The film provides glimpses of his editorial callousness, including moments where he egg-dips reporters on the front line to get more dramatic reactions for his audio recordings. His sexual tension with both Lee and Jesse suggests a predatory energy that maps onto the broader critique of how journalism consumes its subjects. When he finally gets his quote from the cowering president, his reaction is not horror at witnessing an execution, but professional satisfaction at capturing a historic soundbite. The analyses and explanations note that Joel never fires a weapon or directly causes harm. Yet his hands are arguably the dirtiest in the film's moral economy because he fully understands what he is facilitating. He represents the amoral center of a profession that has convinced itself neutrality is the highest virtue while enabling atrocity through its passivity. His survival to the end, grinning beside the corpse of the president, offers the film's most cynical assessment of who ultimately thrives in the attention economy. The sound design of the film constitutes a character in its own right, a meticulously layered assault on the audience's nervous system that redefines how war violence can be experienced in a theater. These analyses and explanations observe that gunshots do not sound like the familiar movie trope of distant cracks, but like physical impacts that seem to originate inches from the viewer's ear. The sound team recorded live ammunition at various distances to capture the specific acoustic signature of rounds passing through different materials, resulting in a sonic landscape that is horrifyingly distinct. The film weaponizes silence, creating moments of such absolute auditory void that the sudden return of noise becomes a physical violation of the body. The Jingle Bells sequence exemplifies this approach, layering an obsessively repetitive children's melody over the rhythmic punctuation of sniper fire until the two become musically indistinguishable. Garland's refusal to provide a traditional score, opting instead for diegetic music and ambient terror, denies the audience the emotional guidance that orchestration normally provides. The tinnitus-like ringing that persists after explosions replicates the auditory damage that actual combat inflicts, a persistent reminder that war's effects continue long after the shooting stops. The final sequence inside the White House employs a soundscape of muffled gunshots, cracking plaster, and panicked breathing that makes the audience feel trapped inside the building alongside the characters. The visual grammar of Rob Hardy's cinematography deliberately blurs the boundary between documentary realism and composed art photography, a tension that mirrors the journalist's own struggle to aestheticize horror. These analyses and explanations note that the film frequently switches between the clean, composed wide shots of Lee's digital camera and the grainy, saturated textures of Jesse's analog film stock. This dual visual register creates a running commentary on how different technologies mediate violence, with the older medium possessing a warmth and humanity that the digital clarity lacks. The color palette drains gradually as the team moves closer to Washington, D.C., beginning with muted natural tones and ending in the monochromatic gray of urban rubble. Wide shots of burning suburbs and abandoned strip malls derive their power from the juxtaposition of mundane American architecture with the visual vocabulary of foreign war zones. The sequence where the journalists drive through a forest fire constructs images of apocalyptic beauty that implicate the audience in the same aesthetic appetite that the film critiques. When Sammy's body is photographed lying in a field of flowers, Lee's decision to delete the image registers as a rebellion against the very visual tradition she has spent her career advancing. The film's final still image, Jesse's photograph of Lee's corpse, freezes on screen long enough to force the audience to examine their own response to its composition. The film's engagement with race and identity politics is characteristically oblique, operating through strategic absences and microaggressions rather than explicit commentary. The analyses and explanations observe that the execution of the Hong Kong journalists for being insufficiently American crystallizes how Civil War transforms national identity from a civic proposition into an ethnic blood test. The militiaman's question, "What kind of American are you?" implies a taxonomy of belonging that supersedes legal citizenship, a hierarchy rooted in nativist fantasy. The film scatters less obvious moments of racial tension throughout the earlier scenes, including a gas station encounter where the attendant's suspicious glances at the non-white members of the press corps carry unspecified but palpable threats. The Western forces themselves appear to be a multiracial coalition, a narrative choice that complicates any attempt to map the conflict onto contemporary American racial polarization. Garland seems to argue that the fracture he imagines transcends familiar identity categories, descending instead into a Hobbesian war of all against all where previous solidarities dissolve. The Black Secret Service agent who refuses to confirm the president's location while the White House crumbles around him offers a poignant study in institutional loyalty persisting beyond all rational justification. The film suggests that in the chaos of civil collapse, racial identity can be simultaneously irrelevant to the larger military conflict and lethally determinative in particular interpersonal encounters. The characterization of the president, portrayed by Nick Offerman, draws deliberately on Offerman's public persona as a figure of gruff masculine competence to subvert expectations about authoritarian leadership. These analyses and explanations note that the president never appears in meaningful dialogue with citizens, never explains his policies, and never attempts to justify his third term beyond the brute fact of his power. His isolation within the White House, increasingly reduced to a single room as the Western forces advance, visualizes the claustrophobic paranoia of the dictator who has lost contact with reality. The rehearsed speech he practices at the film's opening reveals a man who understands leadership as performance, delivering platitudes about victory while his country burns. His final moments, cowering under the resolute desk and begging for mercy, constitute a deliberate anticlimax designed to strip fascism of its mystique. The president behaves exactly as a cornered animal, all ideological conviction evaporating when confronted with the muzzle of automatic weapons. His plea, "Don't let them kill me," becomes the final quote that Joel records, a pathetic epitaph for a regime that promised greatness. The film denies him a martyr's death or a defiant last stand, offering instead the image of a terrified old man shot while begging for his life. This depiction argues that authoritarianism is, at its core, a coward's philosophy that collapses the moment its enforcers switch sides or lose faith. The sniper sequence at the Christmas fair earns its extended treatment in these analyses and explanations for the way it distills the film's entire philosophy into a single, absurdist tableau. The environment literalizes the collapse of American innocence, with animatronic reindeer and fake snow providing obscene contrast to the very real bullets cracking through the air. The journalists shelter behind bumper cars while a protracted gunfight unfolds between snipers so distant they remain invisible throughout the entire scene. When Joel shouts to a nearby soldier to ask who they are fighting and why, the answer he receives is the film's thesis statement rendered in dialogue. The soldier does not know, does not care, and considers the question itself a luxury of outsiders. This exchange dismantles the audience's expectation that combatants possess political consciousness, arguing instead that civil war rapidly devolves into pure survivalism. The stalled amusement park ride playing Jingle Bells in a broken loop transforms the holiday classic from a signifier of cheer into an unbearable torture of repetition. The scene refuses to resolve, ending not with one side victorious, but with the journalists simply moving on, leaving the anonymous soldiers to their inscrutable violence. This structural choice replicates the experience of war reporting, where stories rarely have neat endings and comprehension is perpetually deferred. The role of technology and social media in the depicted conflict receives subtle but significant attention, particularly through the characterization of the younger generation of journalists. These analyses and explanations note that the film's world does not feature the familiar visual language of Twitter feuds or viral videos, suggesting a near future where the internet has fragmented along with the nation. The journalists' reliance on satellite phones and physical notepads implies an infrastructure collapse that has rendered digital communication unreliable. When Jessie develops her film in improvised darkrooms, the anachronistic process reads as a ritual of authenticity that separates serious documentarians from the horde of smartphone-wielding amateurs. The absence of social media from the film's visual landscape is itself a political statement, imagining a civil war whose documentation requires the risk of physical presence rather than the safety of remote posting. The film's climactic photograph, the image of soldiers standing over the president's body, gestures toward the trophy pictures from Abu Ghraib and other modern atrocities, suggesting a continuity of photographic cruelty that predates the digital age. Garland avoids showing any character looking at a phone screen, a discipline that forces the audience to experience events solely through the embodied perspectives of the journalists. The relationship between journalism and trauma receives its most explicit treatment in the sequences depicting how the characters manage the psychological aftermath of what they witness. These analyses and explanations highlight that the film never shows Lee attending therapy or articulating her pain in words, instead conveying her damage through compulsive behaviors and physical dissociation. Her habit of cleaning her camera lens, repeated obsessively throughout the film, reads as a ritual of control in a world where every other variable is chaotic and threatening. The scene where she scrubs blood from her skin in a motel bathroom invokes Lady Macbeth, suggesting a guilt that cannot be washed away regardless of professional justifications. Jessie's trauma manifests differently, appearing as a series of almost imperceptible flinches that gradually disappear as her nervous system acclimates to violence. The film suggests that the true horror of war journalism is not the acute terror of a single event, but the chronic accumulation of moments that gradually reorganize the personality around survival instincts. When Joel sleeps soundly despite the day's atrocities, his uncomplicated rest reads as monstrous precisely because it indicates an absence of the human response that the film values. The comparative study of trauma responses among the four journalists offers a taxonomy of how different psychological constitutions adapt to sustained exposure to atrocity. The film's treatment of the American landscape transforms familiar geography into a haunted dreamscape through the strategic use of locations that hover between the recognizable and the apocalyptic. The analyses and explanations explore how a Pennsylvania gas station becomes a theater of implied torture, a West Virginia forest houses a mass grave, and the National Mall fills with military vehicles and images that deliberately echo the Iraq War footage beamed into American living rooms for 2 decades. This inversion, bringing the visual vocabulary of foreign intervention home to domestic soil, constitutes the film's most potent political intervention. The smoking ruins of suburban developments and the refugee camps erected in stadium parking lots strip the exceptionalism from American identity, reducing the United States to the same condition as every other nation that has suffered internal collapse. The journey structure of the narrative, moving geographically from New York to Washington, transforms into a moral descent from the relative safety of functioning society into the Hobbesian core of total state failure. The scenes depicting empty highways littered with abandoned cars reference the photographic tradition of disaster road trip narratives, From the Road to the Last of Us, while grounding the apocalypse in specifically recognizable American infrastructure. The climactic assault on Washington, D.C. represents a set piece that reimagines iconic American monuments as tactical positions in an infantry battle, a visual sacrilege that carries enormous symbolic weight. These analyses and explanations note the deliberate echoes of Civil War photography, particularly the images of Richmond in 1865, creating a temporal collapse between past and present iterations of American self-destruction. The Lincoln Memorial becomes a fortified bunker, the reflecting pool a defensive moat, and the White House corridors a kill box where Secret Service agents make their last stand. The Western forces' use of helicopter gunships against the neoclassical architecture of federal buildings produces images that consciously reference the fall of Saigon, another American-supported government collapsing under military pressure. The journalists move through this chaos not as neutral observers, but as participants whose presence the soldiers tolerate only because the battle itself craves documentation. The sequence where a Secret Service agent is killed mid-sentence, his body slumping against a wall adorned with presidential portraits, encapsulates the film's argument that institutional authority provides no protection against ballistic reality. The final breach of the Oval Office, with its iconic resolute desk becoming both hiding place and execution chamber, strips the presidency of its mystique in a single, ruthless gesture. The film's engagement with the ethics of war photography extends beyond the narrative into the viewing experience itself, constructing the audience as complicit in the consumption of suffering. These analyses and explanations argue that every moment of beautifully composed violence forces viewers to recognize their own appetite for the spectacle they are ostensibly condemning. Garland denies the audience the alibi of cinematic distance, using the journalist characters to mirror our own position as witnesses who can do nothing to intervene. The recurring shots of Lee and Jesse looking through their viewfinders become unsettling doubles for our own gaze at the screen, implicating us in the same economy of turning death into image. When Jessie selects which of her photographs to keep, she is making editorial choices about which suffering matters, decisions that parallel the filmmaker's own unavoidable curation of violence. The film's refusal to provide actionable political takeaways prevents the audience from discharging their discomfort into partisan satisfaction, leaving an unresolved tension that persists long after the credits. The final image, frozen on a photograph of a heroic sacrifice, asks whether the documentation of courage justifies the passivity that documentation requires. Garland's masterpiece functions ultimately as a mirror held up to a culture that has learned to experience atrocity primarily as aesthetic event, a crisis of spectatorship that extends far beyond the boundaries of the screen. The opening presidential address rehearsal functions as a metatextual commentary on the performance of authority itself, with Nick Offerman's careful modulation of his voice revealing a man who has internalized the aesthetics of leadership while abandoning its substance entirely. These analyses and explanations recognize that the speech he practices contains no policy proposals, no vision of reconciliation, merely the empty assertion that military victory is imminent despite all visible evidence to the contrary. The soundproofed room in which he rehearses becomes a metaphor for the epistemic closure of authoritarian governance, where external reality is systematically excluded from the decision-making chamber. His speechwriter, visible in the periphery, appears exhausted and terrified, a detail that suggests the coercive labor conditions under which even the regime's inner circle operates. The president's insistence on repeating the phrase, "Some are already calling it the greatest victory in American history," betrays a pathological obsession with legacy that supersedes any concern for the citizens dying to sustain his regime. Garland shoots this sequence with a static camera that refuses to grant the president the dynamic visual treatment typically afforded to cinematic leaders, instead rendering him as a static object in an oppressively beige room. The disconnect between the triumphalist rhetoric and the evident panic in the president's micro-expressions creates an interpretive gap that the audience must navigate without guidance. This opening establishes the film's central epistemological question. How can truth be verified when all official sources are demonstrably engaged in propaganda? The president will never face a press conference or a public interrogation, remaining instead a distant figure whose humanity is only revealed in his final, pathetic moments. The rehearsal scene thus operates as a promise that the film will eventually fulfill, the promise of stripping power of its mystique and revealing the trembling animal beneath the suit. The economic infrastructure of the Civil War remains deliberately obscure, yet the film scatters sufficient visual evidence for attentive viewers to reconstruct the material conditions that enabled the conflict. These analyses and explanations note the abandoned shopping malls, the fuel shortages that forced the journalists to barter for gasoline, and the refugee camps where displaced populations have constructed makeshift economies from salvaged goods. The collapse of the dollar is never explicitly stated, but is implied by the prevalence of Canadian currency and the barter system that governs transactions at every stop along the journalist's route. The gas station sequence, beyond its function as a site of implied torture, demonstrates how energy infrastructure becomes both prize and vulnerability in a civil conflict, with the attendants wielding power over travelers through their control of a scarce resource. The journalists' ability to traverse the fractured nation depends entirely on their press credentials and the protection they afford, an arrangement that reveals how information workers occupy a privileged caste in wartime economies. The Western forces' sophisticated weaponry, including helicopter gunships and armored vehicles, suggests substantial industrial capacity and international supply chains that the film never explicates, but that attentive audiences can deduce. The burned-out suburbs through which the team drives represent not just physical destruction, but the evaporation of generational wealth, the American dream literally reduced to ash. Garland's refusal to provide an economist's explanation of the conflicts reflects his broader strategy of prioritizing experiential truth over analytical comprehension. The material conditions of the war are presented as they would be experienced by frontline journalists, as immediate obstacles to survival rather than systemic phenomena to be understood. The film's treatment of gender dynamics within the press corps deserves extended consideration, particularly in how it depicts the specific vulnerabilities and competencies that female journalists bring to conflict zones. These analyses and explanations observe that Lee and Jesse navigate spaces traditionally coded as masculine with a hyper-awareness of the additional dangers their gender imposes, dangers that the male characters largely ignore or fail to perceive. The scene where a militia member leers at Jesse while she photographs an execution registers as a threat that the film never directly acknowledges, but that every woman in the audience immediately understands. Lee's protective instinct toward Jesse is explicitly gendered, a maternal impulse that the film frames as both her most human quality and the vulnerability that will ultimately prove fatal. The bathtub scene, in which Lee washes the blood from her hair while Jesse watches, evokes centuries of artistic depictions of women at their toilette while subverting the tradition by locating the ritual in a context of trauma rather than erotic contemplation. The male journalists, Joel and Sammy, inhabit the war zone with a relative freedom from sexual threat that their female colleagues cannot access, a privilege the film acknowledges without making it the subject of explicit dialogue. The Western forces include female soldiers in combat roles, a detail that suggests the secessionist movement has adopted egalitarian military policies while simultaneously prosecuting a war of uncertain moral justification. Garland's decision to center two women as the emotional core of his war narrative represents a significant departure from genre conventions that typically relegate female characters to the roles of waiting wife or victimized civilian. The relationship between the journalists and the soldiers they embed undergoes a subtle but significant evolution throughout the film, moving from wary coexistence to something approaching symbiosis. These analyses and explanations note that the Western Forces soldiers initially regard the press corps as irrelevant civilians whose presence must be tolerated rather than welcomed. As the assault on Washington intensifies, however, the soldiers begin performing for the cameras, aware that their actions will constitute the visual record of the conflict's decisive battle. This shift exemplifies the feedback loop between warfare and documentation that has characterized armed conflict since the invention of photography, where the presence of a camera alters the behavior of combatants even as it purports to record objective reality. The soldiers who execute the president pose for Jesse's photograph with evident satisfaction, treating the moment as simultaneously a military operation and a photo opportunity. This dual consciousness, the awareness of being both participant in and subject of a historical image, reflects the mediatization of modern warfare that the film critiques. The journalists, for their part, become increasingly dependent on the soldiers for protection, blurring the line between embedded observer and de facto ally. Joel's decision to cease being a neutral journalist and instead help the soldiers locate the president represents the final collapse of the professional boundary that Lee has spent her career maintaining. The film suggests that in a sufficiently total conflict, the pose of journalistic neutrality becomes materially unsustainable, a luxury that only distant observers can afford. The film's engagement with the historical tradition of war photography extends far beyond the explicit reference to Lee Miller, incorporating visual quotations from Robert Capa, James Nachtwey, and the entire pantheon of conflict documentarians. These analyses and explanations recognize that specific compositions in the film directly echo iconic photographs. The falling soldier, the grieving civilian, the execution at close range. Jesse's use of a film camera rather than digital equipment connects her to the analog tradition of war photography, a lineage that the film presents as both noble and deeply compromised by its entanglement with violence. The darkroom sequences, in which images emerge gradually from chemical baths, depict photography as a form of alchemy that transforms trauma into artifact through processes that require patience and physical contact with materials. Lee's deletion of Sammy's photograph represents a rupture in this tradition, a refusal to participate in the transformation of a beloved colleague's death into consumable image. The film's final frozen frame, Jesse's photograph of Lee's body, self-consciously enters the archive of war images that it has spent 2 hours critiquing, adding its own contribution to the canon it questions. Garland's ambivalence about this tradition permeates every frame, simultaneously celebrating the courage required to document atrocity and condemning the passivity that documentation often entails. The film occupies an unstable position, criticizing the aestheticization of suffering while being itself an aesthetic object that derives power from that very process. The geography of the conflict, particularly the Texas-California alliance, has generated substantial interpretive debate that merits careful engagement in these analyses and explanations. The implausibility of these two states forming a political coalition constitutes the point. Garland is signaling that the conflict's fault lines do not correspond to contemporary partisan divisions. The Western forces' name and iconography, which feature a 2-star flag, evoke the American Revolution more than any specific modern political movement, suggesting a foundational relitigation of national identity. Florida's mention as a separate secessionist faction implies a multipolar fragmentation of the United States into regional power blocs whose specific grievances remain opaque. The Carolinas appear as a loyalist stronghold, yet the journalists pass through without incident, suggesting that front lines are porous and allegiance is often performative rather than substantive. The film's refusal to provide a map or a neat taxonomy of factions forces the audience to reconstruct the political geography from fragmentary details, a process that mirrors the experiential confusion of citizens caught in a civil war. The journalist's eastward journey from New York to Washington traces a route through multiple zones of control, each with its own norms and dangers, without the narrative ever pausing to explain the transition. This geographical opacity serves the film's broader argument that political explanations become irrelevant at the point of a gun, where the only salient question is whether the person pointing the weapon considers you an enemy. The United States dissolves not into two coherent nations, but into a patchwork of micro-sovereignties whose borders are enforced by the most heavily armed local faction. The Jesse Plemons sequence deserves further analysis for its function as the film's narrative fulcrum, the moment after which nothing can return to its previous state. These analyses and explanations position this scene as a ritual of unmasking, where the thin veneer of journalistic neutrality is stripped away by a force that recognizes only the binary of friend and enemy. The mass grave that the journalists discover before being captured represents an escalation in the film's visual vocabulary of horror, introducing industrial-scale atrocity into a narrative that has previously depicted violence as interpersonal. The quicklime, a substance historically associated with the disposal of bodies in genocide contexts, triggers associations with the Holocaust that deliberately universalize the American conflict. Plemons' character asks not about political allegiance but about origin, suggesting that in the chaos of civil war, identity becomes essentialized to the point where birthplace determines mortality. His red sunglasses, which obscure the eyes but leave the rest of the face visible, create an uncanny effect that strips the character of the humanity typically communicated through eye contact. The Hong Kong journalist's execution is filmed with a brutal efficiency that refuses to grant their deaths the dignity of extended screen time, mirroring the speed with which life can be extinguished by automatic weapons. Sammy's decision to sacrifice himself, driving a truck through the militia's barricade, represents the film's only unambiguous act of heroism, and it immediately costs him his life. The sequence ends with the survivors physically intact but spiritually shattered, the photographs they carry now stained with the knowledge of how close they came to joining the bodies in the pit. The film's sonic landscape incorporates elements that operate below the threshold of conscious perception, infrasonic frequencies that produce physiological anxiety even when the audience cannot identify their source. These analyses and explanations note that the sound design team, led by Glenn Fremantle, embedded sub-bass rumbles in the transitional sequences that mimic the acoustic signature of distant artillery fire. This technique, borrowed from horror cinema, primes the nervous system for threat even in scenes of apparent calm, preventing the audience from ever fully relaxing into safety. The gunshots were recorded using an array of microphones positioned at multiple distances to capture the specific acoustic characteristics of supersonic rounds passing through different materials and environments. The sound of bullets impacting human bodies was constructed from a combination of Foley effects that, while not literally accurate, produces a visceral response through its departure from sanitized Hollywood conventions. The tinnitus sequence, in which the soundtrack reduces to a high-frequency ringing after a close explosion, simulates the auditory damage that accumulates over a career of proximity to detonations. Dialogue is frequently mixed lower than environmental sound, forcing the audience to strain to hear words over the ambient roar of helicopters and distant gunfire. This mixing decision replicates the actual experience of communication in combat zones, where verbal exchange is constantly threatened by overwhelming noise. The Jingle Bells loop, beyond its thematic resonance, operates as an earworm that lodges in the memory and associates itself permanently with the image of snipers in an amusement park. The film's color grading undergoes a systematic desaturation as the narrative progresses, a visual strategy that externalizes the character's internal emotional emptying. These analyses and explanations chart how the early scenes, particularly those in New York City, retain a muted but recognizable color palette that gradually drains toward monochrome as the team approaches Washington. The forest fire sequence represents a chromatic exception, with the intense oranges and reds of the flames providing a hellish vibrancy that is immediately extinguished as the journalists move into the smoke-choked aftermath. The White House interiors, by the time the journalists enter them, are rendered in a palette of grays and desaturated blues that make the blood spatter on the walls appear almost black. This visual progression mirrors Lee's psychological trajectory from functional numbness to terminal engagement with feeling, the world literally losing its color as she approaches her death. The photographs that Jessie takes throughout the film are presented with a different color profile than the main narrative, the analog warmth of her film stock providing a nostalgic counterpoint to the digital coldness of the surrounding imagery. The contrast between these two visual registers, the films and the photographs within the film, creates a dialogue about the different ways that visual media mediate reality. The final photograph, frozen on screen, combines the warmth of analog film with the horror of its content, forcing the audience to confront the beauty that can inhere in images of atrocity. The supporting characters encountered during the journalist's journey function as a chorus that articulates the various ways civilians process the collapse of national order. These analyses and explanations examine the gas station attendants, whose casual brutality toward looters suggests that the war has licensed behaviors previously restrained by law and social norm. The refugees encountered at a displacement camp offer fragmentary testimonies that provide the only glimpses of the conflict's impact on ordinary citizens, their stories of lost homes and missing relatives standing in for the millions of narratives the film cannot tell. The armed homeowners who fire warning shots at the journalist's vehicle represent the privatization of security that fills the vacuum left by collapsed state authority. Each of these encounters is brief, lasting only a scene, Yet collectively they construct a sociological portrait of a society in which the social contract has been comprehensively voided. The lack of children in the film's frame is a notable absence that suggests either the evacuation of minors from combat zones or a deliberate directorial choice to avoid the emotional manipulation that child characters often enable. The elderly are similarly scarce, implying that the weakest members of society have already perished or been abandoned in the war's earlier phases. The journalists themselves, who once would have been considered non-combatants protected by international convention, now move through a world where no such protections apply and their survival depends entirely on luck and the whims of armed men. The film's marketing campaign and the discourse surrounding its release constitute a paratext that merits inclusion in these analyses and explanations for how it shaped audience expectations and subsequent disappointment. The trailers emphasize the action sequences and the spectacle of American cities under bombardment, suggesting a traditional war film rather than the meditative character study that Garland actually delivered. The casting of Kirsten Dunst, whose association with blockbuster franchises like Spider-Man carries commercial expectations, positioned the film as more accessible than its experimental structure ultimately proved. The studio's decision to promote the film as a political thriller rather than an anti-war meditation generated a mismatch between the audience that showed up and the film that was screening, contributing to the polarized response. The discourse on social media fixated on the Texas-California alliance, with commentators attempting to decode the film's political allegiances based on this single world-building detail. Garland's interviews during the press tour, in which he repeatedly insisted the film was not about contemporary American politics, were received with skepticism from critics who viewed this claim as either disingenuous or naive. The film's commercial success, despite this confused reception, suggests that audiences were responding to something beyond the political debate, perhaps the visceral power of the filmmaking or the emotional truth of the character arcs. The gap between marketing and product ultimately serves the film's themes, as the disappointment of viewers seeking political clarity mirrors the frustration of citizens seeking meaning in the chaos of actual civil conflict. The film's relationship to the Western genre, a tradition that Garland has engaged throughout his career from his novel The Beach through his work on Sunshine and Annihilation, provides a useful framework for understanding its narrative structure. These analyses and explanations recognize that the journalist's journey from New York to Washington follows the pattern of a frontier expedition, complete with hostile encounters at outposts, moments of sanctuary at way stations, and a climactic confrontation at the seat of power. Lee functions as the seasoned frontier scout who knows the terrain and its dangers, while Jesse is the greenhorn whose naivety must be violently dispelled. The automobile, rather than the horse, serves as the vehicle of traversal, a steel horse that offers the illusion of protection while rendering its occupants visible and vulnerable. The lawlessness through which the journalists move reflects the Western's preoccupation with the threshold between civilization and savagery, a boundary that the Civil War has rendered essentially non-existent. The Jesse Plemons character embodies the Western archetype of the psychotic outlaw whose violence follows no code, an agent of chaos who exists outside the organized conflict between the Loyalists and the Western forces. The final showdown in the White House substitutes for the saloon confrontation or street duel that traditionally climaxes the Western, relocating the ritual of violent resolution from the frontier to the center of institutional power. The film's treatment of trust and betrayal among the journalists themselves operates as a microcosm of the larger social breakdown, with each character's decisions revealing the limits of professional solidarity. These analyses and explanations trace how Joel's journalistic ambition gradually eclipses his loyalty to his colleagues, culminating in his decision to prioritize the presidential quote over Lee's safety. His relationship with the Western Forces soldiers, particularly the young officer who guides them through the White House assault, shifts from professional courtesy to active collaboration. Lee's betrayal of her own code, intervening to protect Jesse rather than documenting the moment, represents a failure of professional discipline that the film presents as a moral victory. Jesse's final photograph of Lee constitutes a betrayal of their personal relationship in service of professional obligation, precisely the choice that Lee herself taught her to make. Sammy's earlier sacrifice stands in contrast to these interpersonal betrayals, a death that honors bonds of loyalty even as it acknowledges the futility of the larger enterprise. The film suggests that civil war poisons all relationships, transforming colleagues into potential threats and protectors into the protected in a constant churn of reverse dependencies. The journalists' inability to maintain solidarity mirrors the national failure of social cohesion, personal bonds proving no more durable than the political institutions they document crumbling. The film's spatial politics, particularly its treatment of interior versus exterior spaces, reveal a sophisticated understanding of how architecture mediates violence and safety. These analyses and explanations note that interior spaces in the film are consistently associated with false security, from the gas station where torture occurs to the White House that becomes a death trap. The journalist's vehicle serves as a liminal space, neither fully interior nor exterior, a glass bubble that offers visibility without protection and movement without destination. The exterior spaces, paradoxically, are where the film's moments of genuine human connection occur, the campfire conversations and roadside confessions that constitute the emotional core of the narrative. The mass grave is an exterior space that represents the ultimate dissolution of the boundary between inside and outside, bodies interred in earth that offers no shelter. The amusement park sequence unfolds in an exterior space that has been repurposed for violence, its architecture of pleasure becoming cover for a sniper battle. The Oval Office, the most interior and protected space in the American political imagination, becomes the site of the film's most brutal exterior violence. The president executed on the carpet his predecessors walked in safety. This spatial logic suggests that Civil War dissolves the distinction between sanctuary and battlefield, rendering all spaces potentially lethal regardless of their designed function. The film's representation of the international community, glimpsed through the Hong Kong journalists and fragmentary radio broadcasts, positions the American Civil War as both a domestic catastrophe and a global spectacle. These analyses and explanations examine how the presence of foreign journalists suggests that the conflict has become an object of international fascination, a reversal of the dynamic that saw American reporters documenting the collapses of other nations. The execution of the Hong Kong journalists implies that foreign nationals are not protected by any residual norms of warfare, their outsider status rendering them more rather than less vulnerable. The Canadian currency that circulates as a medium of exchange gestures toward the economic implications of American collapse for the broader North American system. The absence of any United Nations presence, humanitarian corridors, or diplomatic interventions suggests that the international order has either collapsed alongside the American one or has decided that non-intervention is strategically preferable. This global vacuum reflects the film's Hobbesian vision of a world in which international law and multilateral institutions have proven impotent in the face of great power implosion. The journalist's satellite phone, which connects them to editors and family beyond the combat zone, represents a tenuous thread to a world that is watching but not intervening. The film's America is simultaneously isolated and observed, a disaster zone whose agonies are consumed globally as image without consequence. The ethical philosophy underpinning the film can be traced to a specific strand of anti-war humanism that emphasizes the universal vulnerability of the human body over the particularities of political grievance. These analyses and explanations situate Garland's project within a tradition that includes Goya's Disasters of War, Picasso's Guernica, and the photojournalism of Don McCullen, works that depict war's horror without specifying whose side deserves victory. The film's humanism is, however, a bleak variety that offers no redemptive narrative, no suggestion that bearing witness produces meaningful change. Lee's career, by her own admission, has produced no discernible effect on the trajectory of human violence, her photographs consumed and forgotten in an endless cycle of atrocity and documentation. The film's answer to the problem of suffering is not action but attention, a commitment to looking that constitutes the only ethical stance available when intervention is impossible. This position has been criticized as nihilistic or defeatist, yet the film presents it as a form of secular devotion, the photographer as monk whose vocation is testimony rather than salvation. Jesse's decision to photograph Lee's body enacts this philosophy in its most extreme form, the sacrifice of personal grief in service of the historical record. Whether the film endorses this choice or merely presents it as the inevitable endpoint of the journalistic vocation remains one of its central ambiguities. The film's temporal setting is deliberately indeterminate, located in a near future that could be next year or next decade, a choice that enhances its allegorical resonance while frustrating viewers seeking specific predictive content. These analyses and explanations observe that the technology visible in the film is essentially contemporary, with no speculative advances to signal a distant future setting. The absence of drones, artificial intelligence, or other emerging military technologies suggests a conflict fought with current-generation weaponry, making the violence feel immediately possible rather than science-fictional. The third-term president implies an electoral timeline that places the conflict at least 8 years into a hypothetical future, yet the cars, clothes, and infrastructure show no evidence of technological or cultural change. This temporal ambiguity allows the film to function as warning rather than prediction, a meditation on tendencies within the present rather than a forecast of specific events. The journalist's use of film cameras and satellite phones locates the action in a temporal window that is already closing, a moment when analog documentation still coexists with digital infrastructure. The film thus becomes an elegy for a form of journalism that is being rendered obsolete by technological and economic transformations, even as it critiques that form's ethical limitations. The Civil War setting externalizes changes that are already occurring within the media landscape, the collapse of journalistic authority, and the fragmentation of shared reality. The film's debt to the tradition of the road movie, the specifically American genre of self-discovery through geographic traversal, informs its narrative structure even as it subverts the genre's conventions. These analyses and explanations note that the road movie typically charts a protagonist's liberation from social constraints through movement, whereas this film charts the opposite trajectory, a journey toward constriction and death. The American highway system, celebrated in road movies from Easy Rider to Thelma and Louise as a space of freedom, becomes here a gauntlet of checkpoints, ambushes, and existential threat. The vehicle, genre-conventionally a symbol of personal agency, becomes a cage that channels its occupants toward dangers they would otherwise avoid. The landscape through which the journalists travel offers no sublime vistas or moments of transcendence, only the repetitive horror of familiar places rendered strange by violence. The journey's endpoint is not the ocean or the frontier, but the seat of federal power, a destination that represents the opposite of the road movie's typical flight from institutional authority. The film thus inverts the genre's ideological commitments, suggesting that in a collapsing state, movement offers not liberation but exposure, and the only remaining freedom is the freedom to document one's own destruction. The White House assault sequence merits extended technical analysis for its choreography of spatial progression and the integration of practical effects with digital augmentation. These analyses and explanations examine how the journalists move through the building's interior in a series of thresholds, each doorway and corridor representing a narrowing of options until only the Oval Office remains. The Secret Service agents, whose mythical competence has been established by decades of Hollywood representation, are killed with an efficiency that strips them of their cinematic invincibility. The sound of the approaching Western forces, a combination of helicopter rotors, small arms fire, and the percussive impact of grenades, creates an acoustic vice that tightens as the president's defenders are eliminated. The resolute desk, a gift from Queen Victoria that has witnessed countless moments of statecraft, becomes a piece of cover furniture behind which a frightened old man attempts to make himself small. The execution itself is choreographed with a brutal swiftness that denies the audience the satisfying confrontation with presidential villainy that genre conventions have trained them to expect. The soldiers' poses for Jesse's camera, rifles raised and grins wide, introduce an element of performance into the sequence that complicates any reading of the moment as simple justice. The photograph that results, and which will presumably circulate globally, transforms an extrajudicial killing into a symbol whose meaning will be contested by every faction in the post-war order. The film's treatment of the relationship between violence and meaning-making engages with philosophical traditions that extend from Nietzsche through the existentialists to contemporary trauma theory. These analyses and explanations contend that the film presents violence as simultaneously the most meaningful and the most meaningless of human experiences, an event of absolute consequence for its victim and absolute absurdity for any outside observer. The journalist's work consists of extracting meaning from meaningless violence, framing the chaos of a firefight into a composition that can circulate as a coherent statement about the war. This extraction is always a form of violation, an imposition of narrative form on experiences that resist narration. Lee's career has been a sustained exercise in this violence of representation, a practice that has hollowed her out even as it has produced images of undeniable power. Her decision to delete Sammy's photograph represents a momentary refusal of this extractive logic, a recognition that some experiences must be allowed to remain outside the economy of images. Jesse's final photograph reasserts the primacy of the image over the experience, the production of the document over the felt reality of loss. The film offers no resolution to this tension between the necessity of documentation and its inherent violence, leaving the audience suspended in an ethical discomfort that mirrors the journalist's own predicament. The casting of Kirsten Dunst and Kelly Spaney as the film's dual protagonists creates a visual rhyme between two actors whose physical resemblance suggests a genetic or spiritual lineage that the narrative explores without ever explicitly acknowledging. These analyses and explanations note that Spaney's casting was reportedly influenced by her resemblance to a young Dunst, an uncanny doubling that transforms their on-screen relationship into a confrontation with mortality. Lee sees in Jessie the young woman she once was, the idealist who believed that photographs could change the world, and this recognition is inseparable from her knowledge of what that young woman will become. The film's structure positions Jessie as Lee's replacement in an economy that consumes young idealists and transforms them into hollowed-out veterans, a process that the narrative simultaneously critiques and participates in. The baton pass from one generation to the next, symbolized by the cameras and the final photograph, is presented not as a triumph of continuity but as a curse, the transmission of a disease from which recovery is impossible. Dunst's performance registers this recognition in glances and micro-expressions that never resolve into dialogue, the unsaid forming a subtext of maternal grief that complicates the professional surface of the relationship. The film thus becomes a ghost story in which Lee is already dead at the outset, haunting a world from which she has already emotionally departed, and Jessie is the living girl who will become the next ghost. The film's engagement with the concept of the spectacle, as theorized by Guy Debord and his successors, positions the Civil War itself as a media event whose primary existence is as image rather than lived experience. These analyses and explanations argue that the journalists are not merely documenting the war, but are integral to its ontological status, the conflict achieving reality only through its capture by cameras. The Western forces' willingness to accommodate the press corps reflects an understanding that military victory is insufficient unless it is witnessed and transmitted. The president's execution is staged, consciously or not, as a photo opportunity, the soldiers arranging themselves around the body in a composition that will circulate as the war's defining image. The film suggests that in a thoroughly mediatized society, the distinction between event and representation has collapsed, and actions are performed with their documentation already in mind. Jessie's evolution from frightened observer to participant in this spectacle creation tracks the process by which individuals become integrated into the machinery of image production. The film itself, as a representation of these dynamics, inevitably participates in the spectacle it critiques, a paradox that Garland acknowledges through the film's self-reflexive visual strategies. The audience watching the film occupies the same structural position as the consumers of the photographs within the diegesis, a position the film works to make uncomfortable rather than gratifying. The film's sound mixing of dialogue, environmental noise, and the near-constant undertone of distant ordnance creates an acoustic world that conveys information the script never states directly. These analyses and explanations highlight how the varying proximity of explosions and gunfire communicates the shifting position of the front lines relative to the journalist's route. The radio broadcasts that bleed into the soundtrack during transitional sequences provide fragmentary updates on the war's progress, their static, distorted voices offering the only access to a macro perspective on the conflict. The specific regional accents of peripheral characters locate the action geographically without the need for on-screen text. The oral landscape mapping the journey from northeastern urbanity through mid-Atlantic Rust Belt into the southern inflected capital region. The film's commitment to diegetic sound, nearly to the exclusion of non-diegetic score, represents a philosophical position on the relationship between cinema and reality, a rejection of emotional manipulation through music. When music does appear, as in the Jingle Bells sequence or the ironically deployed country songs on the truck radio, it functions as environmental noise rather than commentary, a feature of the world rather than a statement about it. This sonic austerity places the burden of emotional response on the audience, refusing to tell us how to feel about what we are witnessing. The film's visual effects work, supervised by a team that had previously collaborated with Garland on his science fiction projects, required a different register of realism appropriate to the near-future setting. These analyses and explanations note that the destruction of recognizable American landmarks, including the Lincoln Memorial and various Washington monuments, was achieved through a combination of practical pyrotechnics, set extensions, and digital compositing designed to be invisible. The explosions were primarily practical, captured in camera with high-speed photography that preserves the complex fluid dynamics of fire and debris that digital simulations often fail to replicate. The White House interiors were constructed on soundstages with sufficient detail to allow the camera to move through the space in long takes that sell the geography of the building's famous rooms. The digital removal of modern elements from the Washington streetscape, including contemporary vehicles and signage, contributes to the temporal ambiguity that the film cultivates. The blood effects, a crucial element in any war film, were designed to register as material rather than stylized, the spray patterns and pooling behaviors calibrated against reference footage of ballistic impacts. The film's commitment to visual verisimilitude, even within its counterfactual premise, reflects Garland's broader strategy of anchoring speculative elements in a documentary texture. The film's economic analysis, though never foreground, can be reconstructed from background details that suggest a nation whose material foundations have eroded before its political institutions collapsed. These analyses and explanations examine the prevalence of barter, the scarcity of fuel, the abandoned commercial infrastructure, and the disappearance of consumer goods as signs of a supply chain that has disintegrated under the pressure of internal conflict. The journalist's ability to operate depends on access to resources that are dwindling, a precarity that the film communicates through repeated scenes of negotiation over basic necessities. The Western forces' capacity to mount a mechanized assault on Washington suggests access to industrial production and international supply routes that the Loyalist government has presumably lost. The economic dimension of the conflict, while never explicitly analyzed, provides a materialist counterpoint to the film's focus on psychological and ethical questions, grounding the drama of individual conscience in the concrete realities of resource distribution. The absence of functioning banks, stock markets, or any recognizable financial system implies a collapse of abstract value into the brute materiality of bullets, gasoline, and food. This economic desolation provides the unspoken context for the political crisis, suggesting that the constitutional violations of the third-term president occurred against a backdrop of immiseration that the film leaves for the audience to imagine. The film's structure as a journey narrative serves a pedagogical function, each encounter along the route adding a new element to the audience's understanding of the war's texture. These analyses and explanations chart how the gas station introduces the theme of casualized torture, the refugee camp introduces the scale of displacement, the sniper sequence introduces the absurdity of tactical violence, and the Plemons sequence introduces the specter of genocide. This additive structure builds a composite portrait of civil war that no single scene could achieve in isolation, the accumulation of horrors producing a cumulative weight that mirrors the journalist's own traumatization. The journey also serves a temporal function, the days of travel providing space for character development that would feel forced in a more compressed timeline. The rhythm of the journey, with its alternation between moments of intense danger and periods of relative calm in transit, replicates the actual temporal texture of war reporting, where terror and boredom coexist in unpredictable alternation. The journey's endpoint, the White House, retroactively transforms the entire route into a pilgrimage toward meaning that the climax deliberately denies. The president's pathetic death offers no catharsis, no satisfying resolution to the journey's accumulated horrors, only the dead end of a quest whose object was always illusory. The film's political unconscious, the set of assumptions that structure its world without being explicitly articulated, reveals a sensibility that is fundamentally skeptical of all collective political projects. These analyses and explanations argue that Garland's refusal to specify the ideologies of the competing factions masks a deeper claim that ideology itself is a veneer over more fundamental human drives toward violence and domination. The Western forces, the secessionists who are ostensibly the film's protagonists by virtue of narrative proximity, are depicted committing an extrajudicial execution that the film refuses to justify or condemn. The Loyalist government, represented by the president, is a fascist regime whose elimination would seem to be a political good. Yet the film denies the audience the satisfaction of a morally clean victory. The journalists, who might have served as moral arbiters, instead reveal themselves to be driven by professional ambition and personal obsession rather than political conviction. The film's vision of civil war is thus a war without ideological content, a conflict in which the stated reasons for fighting have been revealed as pretexts for violence that seeks only its own perpetuation. This Hobbesian vision aligns Garland with a tradition of anti-political thought that views governance as a fragile lid over a cauldron of human aggression that can boil over at any moment. The film's refusal to take sides is thus not neutrality, but a substantive claim about the nature of political violence itself. The film's visual language for depicting death undergoes a significant evolution over the course of the narrative, reflecting the characters' changing relationship to mortality. These analyses and explanations observe that early deaths in the film are depicted at a remove, glimpsed in long shot, or heard off-screen, maintaining a distance that collapses as the journalists approach the Capitol. The suicide bombing that kills a group of soldiers is presented in a single wide shot, the explosion visible, but its human consequences obscured by distance and debris. By contrast, the executions in the Plemons sequence are depicted in unflinching close-up, the deaths of the Hong Kong journalists rendered with an intimacy that makes the earlier restraint feel like an act of mercy. The president's execution combines distance and intimacy, the camera positioned close enough to see his terror, but far enough to include the soldiers who will kill him in the frame. The final photograph of Lee's body represents the endpoint of this progression, a death captured in a still image that freezes the moment of mortality into an eternal present. This visual trajectory suggests that the film is training its audience, through its runtime, to look at death without flinching, a pedagogical project that mirrors Lee's training of Jesse. The ethical question that remains is whether this training represents a necessary maturation or a catastrophic loss of the human capacity for horror. The relationship between the journalists and their editors, who exist as voices on satellite phones rather than embodied presences, provides a ghostly corporate backdrop to the physical journey. These analyses and explanations note that the editor's primary function is to assign value to journalistic labor, determining which stories merit the expenditure of scarce resources and which deaths are worth risking. Their disembodiment renders them ethically insulated from the consequences of their decisions, much as audiences consuming war photography are insulated from the suffering the images depict. Joel's conversations with his editor reveal a professional culture in which the quality of a story is measured by its proximity to violence, a metric that incentivizes exactly the risk-taking behavior that the film simultaneously critiques and dramatizes. The editor's voices, filtered through the degraded audio of satellite connections, represent a world of offices and deadlines that the journalists have left behind, a phantom bureaucracy whose demands continue to structure their actions. The climactic decision to pursue the presidential interview rather than prioritize safety reflects the internalization of editorial logic, the journalists no longer needing external pressure to prioritize the story over their lives. The profession has colonized their psyches so completely that self-preservation reads as professional failure. The film's representation of weaponry is notably specific in its attention to the material culture of contemporary infantry combat, reflecting research that grounds the speculative scenario in recognizable tactical reality. These analyses and explanations examine how the firearms carried by various factions communicate information about their access to military supply chains, with the Western forces wielding standardized military-issue rifles while the militia groups carry a heterogeneous mix of civilian and military weapons. The Secret Service agents defending the White House carry submachine guns whose compact profile suits their close protection role, a detail that reflects accurate understanding of executive protection tactics. The sound design of each weapon is distinct, allowing the audience to differentiate between the sharp crack of a sniper rifle, the sustained rattle of automatic fire, and the percussive thump of grenade launchers without visual confirmation. The film treats weapons not as fetish objects, but as tools whose specific characteristics determine tactical possibilities, a demystification that aligns with the film's broader project of deglamorizing warfare. The journalists' lack of weapons, and their reliance on armed escorts, constitutes a professional identity that the film presents as both ethically necessary and materially precarious. The only journalist who touches a weapon in the film does so to move it out of the way, a brief contact that registers as a transgression of professional boundaries. The film's treatment of humor, though sparse, functions as a crucial release valve that makes the sustained tension bearable, while also deepening the characterization of individuals who use gallows humor as a coping mechanism. These analyses and explanations note that Sammy is the primary vehicle for this humor, his age and experience providing him with a perspective that allows for ironic distance from immediate horrors. His quips about the absurdity of their mission, delivered with the timing of a veteran raconteur, acknowledge the ludicrousness of their situation without diminishing its gravity. The Jingle Bells sequence derives its power partly from the macabre humor of the situation, the cognitive dissonance between holiday cheer and sniper fire producing an effect that oscillates between comedy and horror. Joel's professional cynicism occasionally shades into a darker humor that reveals the moral flexibility that makes him simultaneously effective and untrustworthy. The film's humor never undermines the seriousness of its subject, functioning instead as an acknowledgement that humans in extremis will reach for whatever psychological tools are available. The near-total absence of humor in the final act, from the Plemons sequence onward, signals that the situation has passed beyond the point where ironic distance is possible. The film's engagement with the tradition of the anti-war film, from All Quiet on the Western Front through Come and See to The Hurt Locker, reveals both debts and departures that situate Garland's project within a century-long effort to make war visible in its true horror. These analyses and explanations position the film as a 21st-century contribution to a genre that has repeatedly discovered that showing war's reality does not, in fact, prevent future wars. This knowledge, the awareness that the anti-war film is a provably futile enterprise, shadows Lee's career and the film's own ambitions. Garland's innovation is to make this futility itself the subject, producing an anti-war film about the impossibility of anti-war films, a document of failure that paradoxically succeeds by acknowledging its own limits. The journalist's inability to affect the war they document mirrors the filmmaker's inability to affect the audience beyond the theater, a parallel that the film encodes through its self-reflexive visual strategies. The tradition of the anti-war film is characterized by an optimism of means, a faith that the accurate depiction of suffering will produce pacifist conviction, that Garland does not share. His film operates instead from a pessimism of means, documenting suffering without expectation that the documentation will change anything, a posture that paradoxically produces a more honest encounter with the material. The film's final image, the frozen photograph of Lee's body taken by Jesse, supports multiple readings that generate productive interpretive tension rather than closure. These analyses and explanations acknowledge that the image can be read as a tribute, the mentor immortalized by the protege she trained, or as a betrayal, the final extinguishing of personal feeling in service of professional obligation. It can be read as a victory, the successful transmission of the journalistic vocation to a new generation, or as a tragedy, the confirmation that the young woman has been irreversibly damaged by her experiences. The aesthetic quality of the photograph, its composition and exposure, is not visible to the audience, leaving open the question of whether it is a good photograph in addition to being a morally fraught one. The film's decision to freeze on this image, holding it long enough to force sustained contemplation, transforms the photograph from a plot point into a question addressed directly to the audience. What do we see when we look at a photograph of a dead journalist? Do we see heroism, tragedy, exploitation, or all three simultaneously? The film's refusal to answer this question, leaving the photograph to function as a Rorschach test for the viewer's own assumptions about journalism and violence, represents Garland's final and most effective evasion of didacticism.